Hello everyone, my name is Irma and I wanted to welcome you to our webinar titled The Future of Hypervisors, Exploring Alternatives in a Changing Market. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. We love that you're here and we hope you find this webinar valuable and walk away with at least one or two actionable insights as you continue to evaluate alternative hypervisors. And if this is not your first time, thank you for tuning back in with us. We are aiming to make these sessions a little bit more engaging, as I just mentioned. So we are providing a few poll questions in the chat throughout our session to ensure that we are covering things you want to hear. So with that said, that first question is in the chat. And if you guys could go ahead and answer, have you personally had to deal with licensing changes in your virtualization platform in the past year? So while you guys are answering that, let's take a look at the agenda for today. This webinar is hosted by Ottava, and we deliver secure, compliant, multi-cloud solutions and a top-tier professional services to address critical modern challenges, all built in industry standards and strong collaborative customer relationships. This webinar is meant to be more of a panelist discussion and broken into three parts: why now and how the landscape is shifting, rethinking virtualizations, and real-world scenarios specifically around migration. We'll leave time at the end for Q&A and a few closing remarks. But before we dive into today's topics, I'd like to introduce our esteemed speakers. Brian Holkeman is Ottava's VP of Product and Business Development and is master of making complex tech feel refreshingly simple with over 20 years in cloud, AI, and security. What sets Brian apart is his unique blend of tech fluency and business instincts. Brian, please give us a wave here. Anything else you want to add there?
No, thanks, Irma.
All
Appreciate it.
right. And then Alan Conboy is joining Brian. He's Ottava's field CTO for Edge and data protection and a straight shooter who's been deep in the tech trenches long enough to know what actually works, whether it's Edge, backup, or building solutions from scratch. Brian, anything you would like to add there?
How can I top that? Glad to be
All
here.
right. Well, thank you both for joining us today. We're looking forward to your insights. Brian or Alan, from your perspective, what are the biggest challenges IT leaders are grappling with today?
Brian, you want
Well,
to go first?
yeah, I'll take it. I think there's plate tectonics that are changing in the industry. There's obviously a lot of history here in terms of virtualization. There's a lot of new suppliers. There's M&A activity. There's shifts in license consumption. So I think organizations are just having to reassess what they're doing with their virtualization stacks and where they're putting them, where the applications are being deployed, and how they're modernizing their infrastructure. So I think it's a really fascinating time. And if you think about the technology sector, like we reinvent ourselves every 20 to 25 years, and we're in one of those time frames right now. And so I think it's a good time to talk about this topic today.
Brian, I would extend on what you're saying and try to sum it up in a single word: uncertainty. The tectonic shifts you're referring to here are happening everywhere all at once. Have been for the last 12 months, 12 to 14 months, really. Infrastructure choices that people made years ago don't necessarily still apply. And the good news is it opens up a window for people to actually go back, investigate, and look at how much progress has been made in the infrastructure space with hypervisors, containers, etc. over the last few years. Well, they've been busy just running their own infrastructure.
Alan, apart from tech tools, why is 2025 different from 2 years ago for virtualization strategies and infrastructure design?
Apart from the physical tools themselves, the tooling, whether you're talking about VMware or Hyper-V or any of the plethora that have risen to the top, let's face it, uncertainty again. Licensing schemes that seem to change week to week. Uh, being essentially secondhand told that, yeah, your business isn't who we really want to focus on, versus, a world where you're just trying to do the absolute best and absolute most with really constrained resources. And, well, let's face it, a geopolitical situation that makes things a challenge for everybody. Uh, it's not 2020, it's not 2022, it's not 2013 anymore.
Brian, anything you would like to add there?
No, I think there's a couple of things, right? So let's just address the elephant in the room. This is not a VMware Broadcom bashing webinar. Like we are, that is not the intent here. But there are changes that have happened in terms of their moves and how they're shifting their license structure from perpetual to subscription, how they're packaging their feature functionality, and how they're renewing and addressing their customer base. So I think you have to eyes wide open, kind of understand what the impacts to your organization are. And then I think, to Alan's point, we're a managed service provider. This is not a commercial for Otava, but we are, as a managed service provider, dealing with a lot of the same things that enterprise customers are dealing with in their data centers, which is about the supply chain and about the cost structures that organizations are going to have to deal with as they manage their way through refresh cycles, as they work with their current suppliers, as they understand the cost basis shifts that are going to happen in the industry. And as Otava, we maintain data centers ourselves. We maintain virtualization infrastructure. We're already getting signals from our suppliers that pricing constructs are going to change. We are also, observing, certain suppliers who are providing quotes to us that are literally good for 24 hours. So you're in an interesting time, and things I think will sort themselves out. But we're all, like, us collectively as technology professionals are having to address these. We're having to talk to our leadership teams. We're having to justify different business cases and cost structures, and trying to figure out what the right path forward is. And I think it's going to be different for every organization.
Brian, I think you hit it right on the head. And out of the gate, I don't want folks attending here to think that this is a bash Broadcom presentation. It's not. Let's face it, VMware is the Neo Plus Ultra when it comes to infrastructure choices, and has been for quite some time. I think the larger point to be made here from a software and tooling perspective is they may be the best choice for some workloads. That may be where some things need to stay. But there's been an awful lot of expansion over the last decade and a half that have brought some really viable alternatives to the top. You see that with the rise of KVM-based hypervisors that power so many different platforms, from Rev to the Google Compute platform to everything from Virtuoso to Scale and Proxmox and everywhere in between. The opportunity here is how I want to look at things. The opportunity to take a look at what you've been missing out on. What was the de facto standard of even 5 years ago or 10 years ago isn't necessarily today.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think we'll dig into this. But I think the thing that we're going to observe around technology evolution in this category is what you needed 15 years ago or 10 years ago and what you need today in terms of the skill sets and the operating models that are available today are vastly different. So it'll be a fun conversation. Irma, lead us through it. You're our MC, so make sure that we stay on track.
Yeah, sounds good. I do see a lot of yes. A lot of people are dealing with licensing changes in their virtualization platform in the past year. So just wanted to throw that comment in there before we move to the next section. If anyone wanted to add anything, we do have a couple minutes, but if not, we can dive into rethinking virtualization and what to look for an alternative. Brian, this question is for you. Where should an organization begin when evaluating alternatives? What are some of the strategic and
Yeah.
architectural questions they should be asking themselves?
Well, I think great question, and I think the it's relative to the options that are available, optionality, that is available to all of the people on the call today, and for Otava, you're just looking at a plethora of technology solutions that are evolving. The transformation is innovation is accelerating. So you're starting to see we had trends uh, over the past 10 years where we're cloud first, and then we moved to edge computing and deploying compute and storage farther out into the infrastructure to support performance and reduce latency. And so I think you're seeing a lot, depending on the organizational architecture and the structure, you're seeing a lot of optionality around what you can do today that you couldn't do 5 years ago. And so I think you have to just stay light on your feet, so to speak, from an architecture perspective, to be dynamic, to take advantage of those things, and to start to stratify your workloads, across all these different opportunities so that you're taking advantage of the best technology and the best cost structures that are available to you moving forward. So, um, I think, yeah, I think the strategies in terms of, the architectures of hypervisors and infrastructure are changing. And so you just want to be able to evaluate those things kind of in a biannual basis to make sure that what you're doing is working for the goals that you have for your company.
You know, I love that term stratification because it really does apply. And when you think about the changes that are happening, not just in the technology space, but in how we do business, things have been enabled over the course of the last 5 years that simply weren't an option. For example, edge computing, the rise of edge computing, and the ability to take those compute resources all the way out to where people are actually doing things, whether it's driving a car or maintaining an oil derrick, or heck, the advances in retail with edge computing. Your choices of hypervisor expand beyond just what you've been historically doing at core and cloud. So that stratification, Brian, really does extend not just across the advances in what's been made available. You know, face it, the hypervisor is largely commodity at this point, but it's also expanded across how we do business, making the choices that take advantage of the stratification of putting workloads where they need to be can mean the difference between success and failure as we move forward over the next 4 or 5 years.
Alan, what is the best way? You just said something that triggered this question. What is the best way to test or mirror workloads before going all in on a migration?
Step one is always understand exactly what the outcome is you want. Full stop. Okay. Yes, modern processors will always run faster than something from 4 or 5 or 7 years ago, but it's more than just that. Having a sandboxed environment available to test not just how does this application behave under this hypervisor or that. As I mentioned a few moments ago, they're largely commodity at this point. There's some minor differences, but nothing that's as huge as it was a few years ago. Having that side-by-side capability with an infrastructure that allows you to say, let's run this here with production data in tandem with our actual current production environment so that we can take apples to apples comparisons, but done in such a way that the kickover, once you hit that success criteria, the fall over from old to new is seamless and near instant. That's critical. There's all kinds of application stacks that'll allow you to do that from a variety of vendors. It's taking the time to understand, again, what's changed in the last 5, 6 years.
Brian, anything that you want to add? Or I know you bring different questions than I do to the table around this topic of what to look for in an alternative.
Well, I think one of the big um, uh, innovations that's happened in the last couple of years that we're all kind of paying attention to and experiencing is the compute power of the GPU, right? So you're starting to see the ability to mitigate performance degradation wherever you want to put these workloads, and so it can be in the data center. So we're modernizing, GPUs in the data center. We're modernizing GPUs in the cloud. We're modernizing GPUs at the edge. So I think some of the traditional drawbacks in terms of performance are starting to melt away. And now you have to take into consideration, it really comes down to two things: cost and latency to me, right? So, are you pushing that workload out where you need to process it, in real time, uh, because you're doing some sort of use case that requires, that the car makes a decision in microseconds and not a minute. So you're evaluating what the constructs or what the application needs to support in terms of latency, but the performance, there's lots of options out there now, and you can scale out a lot differently than you could, um, a few years ago. So you can horizontally scale to get a huge amount of processing power in real time as well. So I think it's interesting to look at those workloads, try to understand what you're trying to achieve, and land them where they should be. And you know, it's almost a pretty simple business case in terms of what's the cost profile that you're getting from these different providers, and what's the performance and latency that you're trying to achieve. And it's almost a different kind of IT business case that you can start to kind of lay out for the organization and explain it in different ways that you know I think we've always been challenged to get business executives to understand technology and why we are doing things. I think it's becoming a lot more clear now.
Brian, you touched on something there that I think shouldn't be overlooked. You talked about the modernization of applications. Let's face it, the world is moving along at a ferocious pace. A moment ago, we touched on edge computing. You touched on GPU, all the way out at the edge as well. What that really tells me, and it falls back to your use of the term stratification, there's another layer that people really need to be thinking about, and I don't feel like they really are yet. And that layer is foundational. We're at that crux point where people really need to reevaluate their infrastructure choices in a really rapidly changing world. When you take the time to really lay the proper foundational choice for infrastructure, from edge to cloud and everywhere in between, right? That puts you at a competitive advantage that speaks to business executives in a way that they aren't necessarily thinking about today. Quite frankly, the ability to roll out a brand new application stack that brings increased efficiency to your foundry floor, that immediately provides value in a retail setting. It's great to be able to code that up. Lots of folks doing that. Lots of folks using AI to do it right now. But you have to have a rapid deployment model foundation in place already at the foundry floor, at the retail location on the ship, to be able to enable that, or your competition is going to go blowing right past you, especially if you're still stuck in 2015 infrastructure. So good on you for bringing both stratification up and acknowledging the fact that the edge to the core to the cloud has changed radically. How we do business has changed radically.
Alan, I'm going to throw a curveball at you. Like, just talk a little bit
Okay.
about, you know, in that hypervisor ecosystem and the
hmm
application development world. Like, how are you thinking? Is the containerization evolving as well, or how are you developing apps in a uh, new and different way? I just want to get your perspective there because you're really good at that.
Sure, no problem. So from a containerization perspective, full virtual machines in a legacy approach to virtual infrastructure. I hate to say it this way, but they're resource hogs. They always have been. And when they were layered into that legacy, what I personally call the inverted pyramid of doom of multiple servers plus multiple switches plus somebody else's SAN and a third-party hypervisor, the efficiency there was, shall we say, lacking. But it was great for running just old school virtual machines. Fast forward to this decade, containerization has really taken off. We see it very heavily in the large enterprise, and we're starting to see it in the distributed enterprise, in the retail chains, so on and so forth. Chick-fil-A is a great case in point in the work that's been done there to use simple containers that can be published via Ansible and runbooks to rapidly, and I mean space of minutes, bring entire new application stacks online that radically increase efficiency while decreasing resource usage. That's the wave of the future. Whether you're talking about K3s or K8s or rancher-based implementations running on top of infrastructure, your infrastructure choices, even with LXC containers, they matter now in ways that they really didn't in 2019. Having an infrastructure in place that makes that trivial is absolutely key. And having one that brings the one thing containers don't have inherently, high availability and fault tolerance, to the table. That's the difference maker.
So I'm going to switch gears slightly here just so we can stay with timing. We did drop in the chat how confident is a team to migrate an infrastructure if needed. And from what I see in the chat, I see a lot of ones and twos, which means confident and someone confident, and then a few that say not so confident or would need help. So I want to really like pivot a little bit into real world scenarios and customer migration here. And Alan, I wanted to ask you to walk us through a recent migration example that stands out and what triggered that change and how did it go?
Sure. So I've got one that comes to mind for me immediately. Uh, Legacy company that's been around since your great grandfather was a boy, actually longer. Okay. Has been running for the last decade and a half in a legacy virtual infrastructure. Servers plus switches plus SAN plus hypervisor plus. The inverted pyramid of doom. They needed to modernize for some of the reasons we just touched on. You know, they wanted to take a look at how do I make my entire core infrastructure much more efficient and easily integratable with cloud resources while maintaining the ability to harvest real data from my manufacturing floors, et cetera. I don't want to say their name here because businesses don't really like having their thrown out without some advanced warning, but they had historically been kind of a slave process, right? Well, they implemented a hyperconverged solution, a true hyperconverged solution, and were able to leveraging tools that are built into modern platforms and third-party tools that are all over the place now, able to migrate those legacy virtual machine infrastructures, or legacy virtual infrastructure machines into their new HCI platform in a matter of a few hours without losing uptime at all. This isn't hard to do in today's world. And simultaneously, they gained the ability to, publish new workloads with a couple of clicks. That's hard to beat. Oh, and doesn't hurt to mention that their new infrastructure clocked in at half the cost of what they'd spent on their legacy stuff. Efficiency in every single layer of your business matters. That's what the focus of infrastructure technology over the last 10 years really has been.
So I want to double click on that. What are other common fears before migration? How does a partner such as Otava help migrate someone if that is what they're looking into? And this could be answered by either Brian or Alan or both.
Well, I've been talking my head off. Ryan, you want to take a shot at that, or you want me to dive in?
Why don't you dive in? I'll jump in as well.
Okay, sounds good. So for those that have been doing the same thing the same way every day and getting intimate with their specific tool over the last decade and a half, right? Chances are very good they're not aware that the stickiness associated with virtual machine formats, be it VHDs, VHDXs, QCOW2s, so on and so forth, that stickiness has been well lubricated over the course of the last especially 5 years. Okay. Now, here at Otava, we maintain an entire team of experts on the varietal sources, shall we say. Understand not just what you want to go to, but where you have been. And also maintain a series of tools to make transitioning from a legacy infrastructure to something that is much newer and hybrid almost trivial for you from your perspective. And quite frankly, blink and you'll miss the cutover. That's what we specialize in doing, is maintaining architectural choices so you don't have to think about it, while simultaneously getting rid of the argument which is better, the hammer or the screwdriver. Let's face it, IT is an entire toolbox nowadays. Folks like Otava, like Brian's team and some of the other teams here at Otava, we're the mechanics. We know what every tool is and what it's for and where to use it. Thoughts, Brian?
Yeah, great insights there, Alan. And I think there's a couple of elements there that I'm thinking about. This concept, and you touched on it momentarily. So there was a lot of there were a lot of challenges a few years ago when this whole concept of lift and shift, and you're trying to port. The portability of applications was a little more challenging. Obviously, if you're consistent on the hypervisor level, it's not as big of a deal. But now there's a couple of things that I think are evolving in the business in the industry. One is, the optionality around the hypervisors has expanded significantly. The tool sets to do those migrations has matured dramatically. And I think the operational overhead is reducing aggressively. So, like, let's just rewind. 20 years ago, we were all getting our VMware certifications, and we're trying to figure out how to run vCenter, and we're training up engineering staff. When I look at the interfaces and the customer experience that is available now, it is so frictionless. It is like
Mhm.
drag and drop. It is just, you can almost have your kids deploy these environments and these applications, and it's just so much easier. So I think there's this you know in my career, like we were always like really worried about what's the operational process impact to moving from one technology to the other. And I think those barriers of adoption are changing, and they're no longer there. So I think it's the way that you consume and absorb some of these new technologies is a lot less impactful to the organization, and I think you can do it a lot faster. So back to the whole topic of the conversation, the optionality is now available both on hypervisor and destination of the workload. So I think it's just getting a lot more efficient for organizations to make changes. And so I think there was probably a mindset a few years ago where that was really hard to do, and I think you can revisit it.
Oh yeah, I think that you're spot on. The ability to take a workload from Hyper-V or VMware and seamlessly drop that into a Nutanix or a Virtuoso-based environment.
Yeah,
Heck, Proxmox has the native ability to read VMDKs and VHDXs on the fly with via its QEMU hooks. The friction that used to, pardon the term, artificially be there has been really engineered around really, really well over the last 5 to 10 years. I'm a huge proponent of Ferris Bueller's. Hey, if you haven't stopped and taken a look around recently, you might have missed something. And in the tech world, you have. There's a lot that's changed.
Definitely. With that, Brian, how can an IT team build a compelling internal business case with finance? What data or steps are needed in order to be able to make that case?
yeah. I think it goes back to an earlier statement where it's becoming much more intuitive for the technology owners in an organization to make their case to the executives, because at the end of the day, so you got to do this a couple different ways. First, you have to understand the cost basis, and so we know that there's different suppliers have different cost bases. You're having to deal with sprockets and core count, core density that is being um, addressed or imposed by some of the suppliers. So you have to kind of work through those architectural elements and really understand the cost basis of what you're dealing with. And that's where you sit down and you get your finance Excel jockeys to help you kind of build out the business case on what you have today, where you're going, and how you're going to effectively and hopefully reduce costs with moving these workloads to different destinations. And then I think from the executive level, you just shift, right? The business cases, the underlying foundation and justification of the dollars and cents. But from a business perspective, you're talking about just different outcomes. You're talking about, hey, what do we want the customer experience to be? What do we want our marketing teams to be able to do to differentiate us against our competition, to drive data driven results much faster? You want to have that kind of framing for the executives. So you're like, okay, it's a net neutral, or it's a cost reduction in terms of the business case. And then here's what we're enabling for the organization. And that is a shift I think that all technology teams need to make, is to be much closer to the business. right? IT's always been that cost basis organization over there. They just spend money. Um, Start to build the relationships with the different organizations that are trying to make, substantial competitive differentiation in your business. Understand what they're trying to do and frame it around the modernization of the infrastructure and the workloads that you're proposing to the executives. So you see this, and AI is a overused term, great example, right? So we're all trying to find out ways to drive better data-driven outcomes in our businesses, and so the framing of that I think is super important, so executives can say like, oh, I get it, and I'm funding it. So that's my perspective on how to kind of connect the finance business case to the end user use case to the executive decision making.
You know, Brian, you raised a really good point there when you brought up AI and the use cases for it as they're seen from an executive level.
Yeah.
To tie that concept back to infrastructure here and to hypervisors, along with the progress that's been made over the last, decade and change, I can think of at least one vendor that has been leveraging AI specifically to lower TCO by creating an environment that self-heals and self-load balances. That frees up human capital to not be trying to chase around which power supply went up in smoke or which cable got kicked out at 2 a.m. in the data center, and allows that executive to instead have that very expensive human capital focus on DevOps and things that move their business forward. Again, it ties back to making the right infrastructure foundational choices in the stratification you were talking about earlier. Those choices really can help make that executive business case in more than just this widget goes that much faster sort of ways.
No, that's a good point, Alan. And we're doing good on time, but want to make sure I get this question in. What advice would you guys, and it'll be for both of you, would you give IT teams trying to build this case and switching hypervisors from something that we haven't covered? I know we talked about reevaluating the timing because it's evolved, but is there anything else that you would give an IT team that's thinking about doing the switch?
I'll let you take the first stab at that, Alan, and cover it from the technology perspective, and then maybe I'll
Sure.
come over the top on how we're thinking about the supply chain and making decisions about the vendors that we're evaluating.
Oh, absolutely. From the perspective of advice that I would give, start by educating yourself on what has changed because there has been so very much. From a pure technical perspective, there are platforms out there today that do things that even vSphere can't. Mix and match across hardware generations, so on and so forth. There are platforms out there today that costing structures are much more stable and consistent with. But more importantly, there are platforms out there today that allow you to lay a foundation. Take the time to educate yourself on the plethora of infrastructure platforms that exist out there. Each has its own niche, each has its own focus area. Virtuoso comes to mind. Absolutely fantastic for I've got tens of thousands of workloads. Scale computing comes to mind for I need to be able to drop workloads in the edge where I don't have IT resources, but I need them to be consistent throughout and need to not be able to think about them. Proxmox, the ability to, on whatever gear, stand up workloads, drag and drop VMDKs or VHDs or VHDXs into and simultaneously with a couple of clicks be spinning up LXC containers. It makes a ton of sense, but none of that existed in any meaningful way back, like you mentioned, Brian, when we were all becoming VCPs. It does now. So step one, educate yourself. Step two, define not just where you are, but where your business is going and where you need to hit that point of intersection a year, 2 years, 5 years out. I think you'll find if you look closely at where the inverted pyramid of doom got you to, well, that may have worked then, but doesn't necessarily hit the point a year from now.
Yeah, we should have had a graphic of the Pyramid of Doom. What help for
I have one.
the
I can't help it.
I know you do. Yeah, so I think those are really good. You're talking about the tech stacks. It's important to understand the requirements, and so I think it's joining the requirements of the application workload to the tech stack that you're considering, and then evaluating what the best fit is. And so there are um, if we go back and talk about some of the changes that have happened at VMware, they've really standardized their bundles. They're standardized the packaging. It's kind of all in one, whether it's VCF, VVF, or what have you. You are subscribing to a number of features that you have access to, and that's fantastic. And you're going to pay whatever the price is for that. But as you look at those different application workloads, and trying to understand what do you really need. And so I think, back to the stratification of your environments, your architecture, and what you're doing, if you're a VMware shop today, you are going to have workloads that make sense to leave on the current stack, right? On VMware, Broadcom. And you're going to also probably have some aha moments where you're like, oh, I don't need, that level of feature functionality, microsegmentation of the network with NSX, and I'm comfortable moving that to some other hypervisor. And you're going to have buckets of workloads and cost structures and vendor management, vendor supply chain decisions that you're going to have. So just, from a mental model perspective, start to think about where do I want to put those workloads based on the requirements and the vendor capabilities, and then start to move things around. And you I think will pretty quickly come to that distributed hypervisor architecture that you should not be scared about. Back to the operational elegance of this, I don't believe that it's as disruptive as it could have been a few years ago. And you're going to be able to take advantage of the diversity of suppliers in the market. And then you're going to be able to take advantage. We've mentioned edge computing a couple times, scale computing. I mean, what a awesome kind of architecture that you can put out there that's highly cost efficient, right? For distributed organizations. And so just go through that process. I think it'll be a good exercise for any organization. And then you're well positioned to justify that and get what you need to implement it inside of your business.
So
You just said something that really jumped out at me, Brian. VMware, when we started this, we said this isn't a Broadcom bashing session because it's not. At the end of the day, VMware is the Peterbilt. It is the Kenworth. It is the Neo Plus Ultra can haul anything, right? It absolutely is. But ask yourself something, guys. If you're needing to pick up a couple of boards to fix the deck on the back of your house, do you take the Kenworth? No. It makes less than no sense and you're making your life worse doing it. As Brian just laid out so eloquently, use the right tool for the job.
with that, we're coming to an end, about to open it for Q&A, and I do see a couple questions in the chat, so I want to make sure I get to ask them for our audience here. They're actually very similar, so let me get through both of them, and then Alan or Brian, you can chime in. Basically is, do you have any insights for migrating from VMware to Proxmox, and is Proxmox cheaper than VMware?
Brian, if you don't mind, I'll tackle that out of the gate
Yeah,
with
yeah,
throw in.
you're very fluent in this topic, so go for it.
Okay, so Proxmox. Let's define what it is first. Okay, KVM, kernel virtual machine, is a native part of the Linux kernel, any Linux distribution, going back 12, 13 years now. Okay, Proxmox is a truly sane wrapper around that KVM core. Now, the tooling that Proxmox is built on top of, QEMU, etc., has spent the last decade and change doing things like making the ability to read from existing VMware virtual hard disks, VMDKs, trivial. There's even pieces in there that'll allow you to reach in and control a vSphere implementation, control ESXi boxes natively from QEMU. The troubles that people had a decade ago moving VMDK-based workloads into Linux writ large, whether that's any of the distros based on KVM, those have largely been ameliorated. Now, there are features that exist in VMware that simply don't elsewhere. The capabilities of NSX and microsegmentation for large networks and large network implementation and virtual switching, there's none better. There's alternatives. There's virtual switching alternatives in all of the other platforms, or almost all of them at one level or another. But it's not as difficult as you might think. Standing up a Proxmox instance, even clustering a Proxmox instance together with multiple boxes, using Ceph, etc. Again, they make it incredibly easy to do. Stand up that sandbox. Try it for yourself first. Okay.
Okay,
It's not difficult, but it's doable.
I do see a couple comments and a question here. The comment is VMware migration is a big question right now with the changes from Broadcom. And then a question followed up by a different member. How difficult would it be to migrate from VMware to Nutanix HV?
Nutanix AHV. I should be very upfront with you. I know Duraj and the founding crew over at Nutanix. Duraj is a great guy. He truly is. End of the day, Nutanix was started essentially to be a storage delivery mechanism for ESX. If you go back a few years in the very large enterprise, you might have had 6 dozen DL380 G8s at the time and 3 or 4 or 5 Cisco 6509 director class switches and enough EMC Symmetrics or Symmetri, however you make that plural, plus enough Enterprise Plus licensing to sync a battleship. Well, that's what Nutanix was originally built for, was to make that admin's life easier by getting rid of the Symmetri piece and leveraging what was built in. Well, you asked specifically about AHV. Guess what AHV is? It's Linux KVM. End of the day, that's exactly what it is. No more, no less. Leveraging the same role that ESX played in the Nutanix world that provides that hypervisor layer. Okay. Migration into an AHV based environment. And Nutanix has done a great job with their Move product. Is again not difficult. With Nutanix, from a hyper-converged perspective, it's all about the enterprise-focused tooling. And from a hyper-converged or large data center perspective, they're an excellent choice. For anything less than large enterprise, mid-market, SMB, I'd recommend that you take a look at something else. Not quite as cost effective, and you're back to the Peterbilt argument.
So I do want to open it up for Q&A here, but while the questions come through, I do see a comment here for you, Alan. It says, I remember Alan from Scale. We were evaluating Scale versus Nutanix, and he was on the sales sides back in 2016. LOL.
Jerome,
Here we
great to
go.
see you again.
He's a legend.
It's awesome.
Any other questions you'd like us to tackle here?
I don't see anything in the chat at the moment.
I do see
Anything?
one from Jasher saying, is
Okay, go for it.
Proxmox less expensive than VMware? Well, it depends on how you define less expensive. You can download Proxmox for free.
Yeah.
You can build an entire hyper-converged infrastructure leveraging them for free. And it comes with the guarantee that if it breaks, you get to keep both pieces. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not going to base my entire infrastructure choice around just that. However, it is a fantastic wrench in the toolbox if you use it appropriately. Not going to put my entire world in something that I pieced together myself. But that said, yeah, it's less expensive from a acquisition perspective. From a runtime perspective, maybe not so much.
Yeah, I think one thing we didn't really touch on there, Alan, along the way is, how are you viewing your own vendor supply chain, right? And through this infrastructure refactoring, do you have core skill sets in your business today that you're comfortable doing what you're doing, right? And how are you going to adopt different hypervisors and deployment models and architectures, and do you want to evaluate different companies out there who can take some of that burden off you? Now we're evangelizing the fact that we think technology adoption is different today than it was 5 or 10 years ago, and I believe that to be true. But there's lots of companies out there like Otava that can take some of that burden off of you. So do what you do well, and maybe evaluate other third parties who have the skill sets, right? So we've got multi-hypervisor expertise across our business. Do you want a company like Otava to help you do those migrations, run those new environments, monitor and patch and do all the other things you want to do with your applications? So something to think about. I think you can take advantage of the ecosystem that's out there to improve your operating model.
Absolutely. You're spot on with that, Brian. Let's face it, guys, it's not on-prem versus cloud anymore.
Yeah.
Don't get caught in that circle.
Yeah.
It's about holistic hybrid infrastructures that let you put the right parts in the right places using the right tools. It's time to change your thinking just a little bit.
I do see a question in chat, and we have a couple of minutes here. What is the biggest gotcha that VMware can do that Proxmox can't?
Oh, good question. Good question. Two things leap to mind. We touched on NSX, network microsegmentation, and network virtualization. That still stands as part of this. But one of the other biggest pieces, to my mind, that VMware does incredibly well, that Proxmox not so much, is the storage stack. VMware with vSAN,
Yeah.
even though it can be a little complex to set up and get going, is significantly faster and more stable than cobbling together Ceph, etc.,
Yeah.
to attempt to replicate that functionality in a Proxmox environment. You can do it. You absolutely can. You can also use NFS. That's not the world's best idea. So I think the level of time, focused time and energy that VMware put into vSAN really stands out when you start comparing that to build your own, which is really where Proxmox sits in my mind. The other thing that I would point out writ large is historically one of the reasons that it was difficult to move from one hypervisor or infrastructure choice to another was actually third-party vendors. The stickiest thing in all of IT is actually backups. It absolutely is. And I saw a whole lot of people that wanted to make a change to various other platforms for a variety of reasons, but couldn't because their process was built around automation with a given backup vendor's formats. That's changed, especially over the course of the last year. We're talking about Proxmox. Well, Veeam now supports it. Let that sink in.
I
The
think you just gave us our.
ecosystem that guides things really has started to open up and allow flexibility. Brian, I interrupted you there. I apologize.
No, no, I was just going to say, I think you just established our next webinar topic.
Sounds great.
Thank you both for your insights, and thank you, audience, again for making the time and participate and asking all these great questions. We are looking forward to seeing you at our future webinars. We are at time, so with that, this will conclude our webinar. We hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and if you have any additional questions, please feel free to email hello@ottava.com. Until next time, thanks, guys.